Broderick stuffed her clothes into garbage bags and threw them onto the driveway like trash. 7 months pregnant, Nadine stood barefoot on the concrete while the entire cul-de-sac watched. "Follow your bags." His mistress sat inside, already making herself at home. Nadine didn't cry, didn't argue. She reached into her pocket and felt the USB drive she'd been carrying for weeks, then picked up her bags without a word, because everything Broderick thought he owned was about to become hers. The garbage bags hit the pavement one after another. Black plastic dragged across a driveway that Nadine had pressure washed herself 2 summers ago when Broderick said he didn't have time. Each bag split a little on impact, and a sleeve or a shoe poked through the rip like something trying to escape. The neighbors heard it first, the scrape of luggage across concrete, the slam of the screen door, the voice of a man who had stopped caring who was listening. "I said, follow your bags, Nadine. Don't stand there looking stupid." He said it loud, loud enough for Mrs. Whitfield across the street to set down her watering can, loud enough for the teenage boys on the corner to stop their basketball game and stare, loud enough for the mailman 2 houses down to slow his truck and pretend he wasn't watching. Broderick didn't whisper his cruelty. He announced it. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the neighborhood to see a man taking back his kingdom. Nadine stood barefoot on the concrete, 7 months pregnant, her belly round and low beneath a gray cotton dress that she'd ironed that morning because she still believed in taking care of herself, even when nobody else did. Her hands hung at her sides. Her feet were bare because Broderick had thrown her shoes into the second bag, and she hadn't had time to dig them out. A pebble pressed into the sole of her left foot. She didn't shift her weight. Through the front window, a woman was visible on the couch. Shayla, legs crossed, phone in hand, scrolling through something like the driveway wasn't happening. She'd already rearranged the throw pillows, already moved Nadine's magazines off the coffee table, already poured herself a glass of lemonade from a pitcher Nadine had made that morning. The condensation dripped down the glass and onto the coaster Nadine's mother had given them as a wedding gift. And Shayla looked up, just for a moment, and made eye contact with Nadine through the glass. She didn't look away. She didn't look guilty. She tilted her head slightly and smiled. The kind of smile a woman gives when she believes she's already won. Broderick's mother, Gwendolyn, stood behind the screen door with her arms folded and her chin slightly raised. She watched her son drag another bag to the curb and said nothing. Not one word of correction, not one syllable of protest. She had raised this man, and she was watching him perform exactly the way she'd taught him. Then she turned, walked back inside, and sat down at the dining table like Sunday dinner was about to be served. She smoothed the tablecloth with both hands, the gesture of a woman settling into a seat she believed she'd earned. The cul-de-sac held its breath. Everyone expected Nadine to scream, to cry, to beg, to fall apart right there on the concrete in front of God and everybody. That's what they were waiting for. The collapse. The theater of a woman undone. Mrs. Whitfield had her hand over her mouth. The mailman pretended to check an address. A little girl on a tricycle stopped pedaling and stared. But Nadine didn't give them that. She reached into the pocket of her dress, slowly, like she was checking the time, and her fingers closed around a small USB drive she'd been carrying for 3 weeks. She held it there, inside her fist, inside her pocket, and the corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile. Something else. Something that looked like a woman who already knew how this story was going to end. She picked up every bag, one by one, loaded them into her trunk without rushing, closed it with a soft click, got into the driver's seat, adjusted the mirror, and drove away without looking back. She didn't peel out. She didn't gun the engine. She pulled away from that curb the way someone leaves a place they know they'll never need to return to. Everybody on that block felt sorry for Nadine, but pity was the last thing she needed, because inside that pocket was something worth more than the house, the car, and the man standing in front of it. 2 years earlier, Nadine met Broderick at a community business mixer in a rented hall off Martin Luther King Boulevard. She was 26, working as an accounting analyst for a mid-sized logistics firm, the kind of woman who arrived on time and left with business cards she'd actually follow up on. He was 32, a regional sales director with a new watch, a pressed shirt, and a smile that made you forget he hadn't asked you a single question about yourself. He talked about his plans, his 5-year projections, his vision for growth. Nadine listened the way she always did, not because she was impressed, but because she was calculating. That was the thing about Nadine that most people never understood. They mistook her silence for softness. They saw a quiet woman and assumed she had nothing to say. But Nadine's mind was always working. She counted things, numbers, patterns, the distance between what someone said and what they actually did. She noticed that Broderick said "I" 14 times in their first conversation, and "we" 0 times. She noticed, and she filed it away. They married 8 months later in a small ceremony at Greater Light Fellowship Church. Pastor Achebe officiated. Gwendolyn wore white to the wedding, a floor-length ivory dress with pearls, which Nadine noticed but didn't mention. It wasn't worth the argument, not then. The early months were warm. Broderick brought flowers on Fridays. They ate dinner at the table instead of the couch. He called her "my genius" because she managed their finances so well that they qualified for a mortgage within a year. Nadine co-signed on the house. She handled the paperwork, the down payment, the insurance, the inspections. Her income covered 62% of the closing costs. Broderick signed where she told him to sign and said, "That's why I married you." And at the time, it sounded like a compliment. She didn't realize until later that it was a confession. Then the promotions started. First one, then another. Broderick's salary jumped. His hours shifted. He started coming home smelling like a cologne Nadine hadn't bought for him, something sharp and expensive, the kind of fragrance a man wears when he's dressing for someone else. He joined a gym he never mentioned joining. His phone was always face down on the nightstand. He stopped asking about her day. Gwendolyn started visiting more often. Every Sunday, she sat at the dining table and watched Nadine cook while offering commentary like a judge at a competition nobody had entered. "You're gaining weight early, baby. Broderick needs a wife who keeps up with him." She said it sweetly, the way poison is sometimes served in a porcelain cup. "Maybe you should let him breathe a little. Men like Broderick need space to grow. You can't hold a man like that too tight." She patted Nadine's hand when she said it, as if she were delivering wisdom instead of wounds. When Nadine found out she was pregnant, she told Broderick over dinner. She'd made his favorite, blackened catfish, garlic mashed potatoes, collard greens with smoked turkey. She placed the positive test beside his plate like a gift wrapped in hope. He looked at it, nodded once, said, "All right," then picked up his fork and asked if there was hot sauce. He didn't touch her hand. He didn't stand up. He didn't say a single thing about the child forming inside the woman sitting across from him. That night, Nadine lay in bed beside a man who had already left the marriage in every way except physically. She stared at the ceiling and placed her hand on her stomach and made a quiet decision that she would never be unprepared again. Not for him. Not for anyone. A week later, she found an insurance document on the kitchen counter. It listed Broderick as the sole owner of the property. Sole, not joint, not co-signed. Just his name, alone, as if hers had never existed on a single line of the documents she had organized, filed, and funded. Nadine photographed it with her phone, slid it back into the stack of mail, and said nothing. That was the first time her instincts told her to start paying attention, not to the man, to the paperwork, because paperwork doesn't lie. People lie. Signatures don't. And then Gwendolyn brought Shayla to Sunday dinner, introduced her as Broderick's colleague from the regional office. Shayla was 26, sharp-featured, confident in the way that only comes from being told you're beautiful too many times, by men who should have been telling their wives instead. She sat too close to Broderick, laughed too loud at things that weren't funny, touched his arm when she made a point, and left her hand there 1 second too long. Gwendolyn smiled at every touch like she was watching a garden she'd planted start to bloom. Nadine set the table, poured the tea, cleared the plates, and memorized the name on the woman's ID badge that she'd left on the entryway table. She didn't confront anyone. She didn't ask a single question. But that night, after everyone had gone, she sat alone in the kitchen and typed that name into a search bar. And what she found confirmed what her body had already been telling her for months. Some people collect evidence without knowing why. Nadine wasn't one of them. She always knew. 3 months before the driveway. A Tuesday night. Broderick was in Charlotte for a sales conference, or so he said. Nadine sat in the home office at 11 o'clock with a glass of water and the blue glow of his laptop screen reflecting off her face. He'd left it open. Not unlocked. The password was their wedding anniversary, which told Nadine everything she needed to know about how little he thought of her ability to look. The emails were arranged by date. The most recent was from a real estate attorney named Gerald Whitmore, and the subject line read, "Title Transfer, Revised Timeline." Nadine opened it. Her eyes moved line by line. Broderick had been working with this attorney for 2 months to transfer the house title solely into his name. The filing was scheduled for 3 weeks before Nadine's due date. The timing was not accidental. It was surgical. She scrolled down, deeper, and that's when the second wound opened. There was a chain of emails between Broderick and Gwendolyn. His mother had recommended the attorney. His mother had outlined the strategy. In one message, Gwendolyn wrote, "Get her off the paperwork before she delivers. After that, it gets complicated. A baby changes the math, Broderick. Handle it now." She'd signed it with a heart emoji, like she was sending a birthday card and not a blueprint for destroying her daughter-in-law's life before her grandchild was even born. Nadine's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She did not tremble. She did not cry. She read every message twice, slowly, the way she read financial documents, looking for the numbers behind the numbers. Then she found the texts. Broderick and Shayla. 5 months of messages. Plans for weekends. Nadine thought he spent at conferences, photos she wished she hadn't seen, pet names, promises, a text from Shayla that said, "When are you going to stop pretending with her?" And Broderick's reply, "Soon, just waiting on the paperwork." That line hit different from everything else, because it meant the affair and the title transfer were connected. He wasn't just cheating. He was building a future with another woman using a house his wife had paid for. And his mother was drawing the blueprints. The betrayal wasn't just a man cheating. It was a man and his mother building a machine designed to erase Nadine from her own life before her child was born. Every Sunday dinner, every sweet comment, every glass of tea Gwendolyn accepted from Nadine's hand. All of it was a mask stretched over a plan that had been running for months. Nadine closed the laptop gently. She went to the kitchen, opened a drawer, and pulled out a USB drive she'd bought 2 weeks earlier when the insurance document first made her suspicious. She returned to the office and downloaded everything: the title transfer paperwork, the attorney correspondence, Gwendolyn's emails, the texts between Broderick and Shayla, the original co-signed mortgage documents that still bore her name, bank statements showing her income funded 62% of the down payment, renovation receipts with her signature, every digital fingerprint of a betrayal that thought it could hide in plain sight. She put the USB drive in her pocket. Then she closed the laptop, wiped the browser history, turned off the desk lamp, and went to bed beside a man who didn't know she'd just downloaded every page of his betrayal into something small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. 2 days later, Nadine met her cousin Imani at a quiet cafe off Piedmont Avenue. Imani was 31, a paralegal at a family law firm, sharp, careful, loyal in the way that only blood can be, the kind of woman who showed up with a legal pad and didn't ask unnecessary questions. Nadine slid the USB drive across the table like it was a grenade with the pin already pulled. She said 4 words: "Tell me what I have." Imani took the drive home that night. She called Nadine the next morning. Her voice was tight, controlled, the voice of a woman who had read something that made her angry on someone else's behalf. "He hasn't finished the transfer yet. You still have time. But if he files before the baby comes, it gets complicated fast." She paused. "Nadine, this is enough to bury him, legally and otherwise." Nadine was quiet for a long time. Then she asked one question. "Can you get me 15 minutes at Pastor Achebe's anniversary banquet next month?" Imani didn't ask why. She didn't need to. She just said, "I'll make it happen." The audience doesn't know it yet, but that question, 15 minutes at a church banquet, is the most important question anyone in this story will ever ask. For the next 3 weeks, Nadine lived 2 lives. The one Broderick saw was the same woman he'd grown bored of, quiet, domestic, predictable. She cooked dinner. She folded laundry. She smiled at Gwendolyn when she visited and poured her tea like nothing had changed. She asked Broderick about his day and nodded when he gave her half answers about meetings that never happened and dinners with people whose names changed every time he told the story. The other life was precise, meticulous, and invisible. She met with Imani's supervising attorney, a woman named Yolanda Price, who reviewed the USB drive contents in a conference room with the blinds drawn. Yolanda looked up from the screen after 20 minutes and told Nadine she had grounds not just to block the title transfer, but to assert full legal ownership of the property. "Your name is on the original mortgage. You funded the majority of the down payment. His filing is fraudulent on its face." She looked at Nadine over her reading glasses. "He thought you wouldn't notice." "He thought I couldn't read," Nadine said. And for the first time in weeks, something close to a smile crossed her face. Not humor, recognition. The recognition of a woman who had finally stopped underestimating herself, even if everyone else hadn't caught up yet. The counterfiling was prepared quietly. Nadine signed it in Yolanda's office on a Thursday afternoon while Broderick was at lunch with Shayla at a restaurant. Nadine used to suggest they try together. She signed her full name in ink that didn't shake. At home, Broderick grew bolder by the day. He stopped hiding Shayla's name on his phone. He took calls in the next room with the door wide open, laughing louder than necessary, performing freedom like a man who didn't know the walls were listening. He told Nadine one morning over breakfast, "Stop asking me questions. I don't owe you an itinerary." She said, "Okay," and handed him his coffee. Black, no sugar. The way he liked it. The way she'd been making it for 2 years for a man who never once said thank you. Gwendolyn came over for lunch on a Wednesday and sat across from Nadine at the kitchen table. She stirred her tea slowly, looked at Nadine's belly, and said, "You know, sometimes a woman has to know when her season is over. There's no shame in starting fresh somewhere else. Some women just aren't built for the long road." She smiled. The kind of smile that costs nothing and means even less. Nadine smiled back. She poured Gwendolyn more tea and said, "You're absolutely right." Gwendolyn blinked. She wasn't used to agreement. She was used to resistance, the kind she could push against, the kind that justified what came next. Agreement unsettled her, though she didn't know why. That night, Nadine was in the kitchen washing dishes when Broderick's Apple Watch buzzed on the counter. A message from Shayla lit up the screen. "When is she leaving? I already picked out curtains for the bedroom," followed by a laughing emoji. Broderick's reply came seconds later, a red heart. Nadine read it. She didn't flinch. She screenshotted it, dried her hands on the dish towel, placed the watch back exactly where it had been, and went back to washing plates. The water was warm. The soap smelled like lemon. And somewhere inside Nadine, a clock ticked forward. She had learned something about power in these weeks. Real power isn't loud. It doesn't slam doors or raise its voice or throw bags on driveways. Real power is the woman who knows everything and says nothing. The woman who serves tea to the people planning her destruction and never once lets her hand shake. Imani confirmed the speaking slot at Pastor Achebe's 30th anniversary banquet. It was the most anticipated community event of the year, a grand celebration at the Fellowship Hall with over 200 guests, church elders, business leaders, Broderick's colleagues, his extended family, his friends. Everyone who mattered to him would be in that room, dressed in their finest, ready to celebrate 30 years of truth and service. Nadine told Broderick she'd been asked to say a few words at the pastor's banquet. He barely looked up from his phone. "Fine, just don't embarrass me." She didn't respond, but somewhere behind her eyes, something shifted. A gear turned. A light came on in a room he didn't know existed. The countdown had started, and Broderick, the man who thought he was 3 steps ahead, didn't even know the clock was running. The week before the banquet, Nadine went to her prenatal appointment alone. She'd been going alone for 3 months. The doctor said the baby was healthy, strong heartbeat, growing on schedule, everything aligned. Nadine touched her belly in the examination room and whispered, "Almost time." The nurse thought she was talking to the baby. She wasn't. At home, Broderick escalated. He stood in the kitchen one evening with his arms folded and said, "You got 2 weeks to figure out where you're going. I want this house clear by the 15th. You can take whatever fits in your car." He said it like he was canceling a subscription, like she was a service he no longer needed, like the woman carrying his child was an inconvenience standing between him and a fresh start. Nadine looked at him. She didn't argue. She said, "Okay, Broderick." 2 words, flat, calm, the kind of calm that should have scared him. He waited for more, for the tears, for the fight, for the performance he'd been rehearsing his response to. It didn't come. And for the first time in months, something flickered behind his eyes that looked almost like doubt. He opened his mouth to say something else, then thought better of it, and walked out of the kitchen. 2 days later, Gwendolyn hosted a family dinner. Nadine arrived on time, dressed simply, hair pulled back. The table was set for 6. Broderick sat at the head. Gwendolyn sat to his right. And then Shayla walked through the front door like she'd been invited. Because she had. She sat in the chair next to Broderick, not across the table, next to him. Close enough to share a plate, close enough for their shoulders to touch. Gwendolyn said, "Shayla, baby, so glad you could make it. You look beautiful tonight." Then she turned to Nadine at the far end of the table, the woman who had cooked Thanksgiving in this kitchen, who had ironed these tablecloths, who had brought flowers to this table every Easter, and said, "Nadine, could you get Shayla a glass of water? She's had a long day." The room went still. Even the candles seemed to stop flickering. Everyone at that table knew what that request meant. It wasn't about water. It was a test, a ritual humiliation disguised as hospitality. A mother-in-law telling her daughter-in-law to serve her replacement. Nadine stood up. She walked to the kitchen. She filled a glass with water, no ice, because she didn't owe Shayla ice, and brought it back. She placed it in front of Shayla without a word. Then she sat back down, unfolded her napkin, and continued eating as though nothing had happened. Shayla smirked. The kind of smirk that only works when you believe the person across from you can't touch you. Gwendolyn sipped her wine. Broderick didn't even look up from his plate. But Nadine's eyes were different that night. Anyone who knew how to look would have seen it. Not anger, not sadness, not defeat. Certainty. The kind of calm that only comes from a woman who has already made every decision she needs to make and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. The next day, Broderick threw her out. The garbage bags, the driveway, the cul-de-sac watching. Follow your bags. This is where the story began. But now the audience understands what came before it. Now they see the full architecture of cruelty that led to that moment. And now they understand why Nadine's calm wasn't weakness. It was preparation. Nadine didn't drive to a motel. She didn't call a friend in tears. She drove to Imani's apartment, carried her bags upstairs, set them in the guest room, and placed the USB drive on the kitchen counter. She looked at Imani and said, "The banquet is Saturday." Imani looked at the drive. Then she looked at Nadine, and she nodded. The next morning, Broderick called. He expected begging. He expected tears. He expected the performance of a broken woman asking to come home so he could have the satisfaction of saying no. Instead, Nadine answered on the second ring and said, "I'll see you at the pastor's banquet. I'm presenting something." Her voice was so steady it made his chest tighten. "Presenting what?" he asked. "You'll see," she said, and hung up. Broderick stared at the phone for a long time. Then he shook his head, told himself she was bluffing, and called Shayla instead. But that night, lying in bed alone in a house that already felt emptier than it should have, he couldn't sleep. Something in Nadine's voice had sounded like a door closing, not slamming, closing, quietly, permanently. And for the first time, he wasn't sure which side of it he was on. The fellowship hall was dressed in white and gold, round tables with linen cloths and tall candles in glass holders. A banner stretched across the stage that read, "Pastor Achebe, 30 years of truth and service." Over 200 people filled the room. Church elders in their finest suits and hats, business leaders, families, friends, and members of a community who had watched each other's children grow up, get married, and build lives. It was the kind of event where reputation mattered, where what people thought of you was worth more than what you owned, where a name could be built or broken in a single evening. Broderick arrived in a charcoal suit with Shayla on his arm. She wore red, a deliberate choice, the kind of red that doesn't ask for attention. It demands it. She walked in like she belonged, and Broderick held her close like a man presenting a trophy he'd just won. Gwendolyn sat at the family table near the front, her posture perfect, her pearl earrings catching the candlelight. She nodded at familiar faces and accepted compliments with the grace of a woman who believed she had earned her seat at every table she'd ever sat at. People whispered, "Where's Nadine?" Someone said she'd moved out. Someone else said Broderick had already filed papers. A woman near the back said she heard it was another woman. The gossip circled the room like a slow current, touching every table, settling into every glass of wine. Pastor Achebe took the microphone and thanked the congregation for 30 years of faith, fellowship, and family. His voice was deep and measured, the voice of a man who had buried friends, married strangers, and watched children he'd baptized grow into adults. He introduced the tribute speakers one by one, local business owners, youth leaders, a city councilwoman who credited the church with her first experience of community service. And then he said, "Our final speaker tonight is someone who has been a quiet pillar in this community for years. Please welcome Sister Nadine." The side door opened. Nadine walked in. She wore a simple navy blue dress, no jewelry, no heels, flat shoes, and a face so calm it made the air in the room shift. 7.5 months pregnant and glowing in a way that had nothing to do with makeup and everything to do with a woman who had decided exactly who she was going to be tonight. She walked to the podium without looking at Broderick, without looking at Shayla, without looking at Gwendolyn. She placed her hands on the podium, adjusted the microphone, and let the silence work for her. Broderick's face changed. The color drained slowly, like watching a tide pull back from shore. His hand tightened around his glass of water. "Pastor Achebe," Nadine began, "for 30 years, you have taught this community one thing above all else, that a house built on lies will not stand." Her voice was warm, measured, the kind of voice that makes a room lean forward without knowing it's leaning. Tonight I want to honor that teaching by telling the truth about my own house. The room shifted. 200 people adjusted in their seats at the exact same time. Forks stopped moving. Glasses paused halfway to lips. The room became a courtroom, and Nadine was the only one who knew she was the prosecutor. She reached into her clutch and pulled out the USB drive. She held it up between two fingers, small, black, unremarkable. The same one she'd felt in her pocket on the driveway. The same one she'd placed on Imani's kitchen counter 2 days ago. Now it was here, under the banquet lights, in front of every person who had ever mattered to the man who threw her away. "On this drive," she said, "is every document that proves what was done to me and my child." She began calmly. She spoke about the house, the one she co-signed, the one her income paid for, the one she furnished and maintained and made into a home while her husband was building a different future behind her back. She described the title transfer, Broderick's attempt to move the property solely into his name through an attorney his mother had recommended. She described the emails from Gwendolyn, the strategy, the timeline, the cold instruction to get her off the paperwork before she delivers. She quoted the exact line. The room gasped. Gwendolyn's hand flew to her chest like she'd been struck. Then Nadine spoke about the insurance document, the one she'd found months ago on the kitchen counter, the one that listed Broderick as sole owner of the property she had built alongside him. But the original policy, which is also on this drive, still has my name on it. His own paperwork contradicts his legal filing. She paused. Let the weight of it settle into every corner of the room. He tried to erase me from a house I helped build, but paper has a longer memory than people. She turned her attention to the affair. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She spoke about Shayla the way a meteorologist reads a weather report. Factual, detached, unshakable. She described the 5 months of messages, the weekends disguised as business trips, the plans made in her bed while she was at prenatal appointments carrying their child, the promises whispered to another woman using the same mouth that had once said, "I do." And then she looked at Shayla. "Shayla, you texted my husband asking when I was leaving so you could pick out curtains for my bedroom." Nadine's voice didn't waver, not even a fraction. "You sent a laughing emoji. You thought that was funny." She paused. The room was so quiet you could hear the ice settling in glasses across the hall. "You can sit down now. The curtains are not yours either." Shayla's face went white. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. A woman at the table behind her whispered, "Oh my God." Someone else covered their mouth with both hands. Shayla gripped the edge of the table like the floor had shifted beneath her, and she was the only one who could feel the earthquake. Gwendolyn stood. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny, to redirect, to do what she had spent a lifetime doing, reshaping the truth until it fit her version of events. But Nadine turned to her before a single syllable could escape. "Mrs. Gwendolyn, I have your emails, every single one. You told your son to remove me from the paperwork before my baby was born. You chose the attorney. You set the timeline. You sat at my table Sunday after Sunday and drank my tea and smiled in my face while you planned to erase me from my own home." Nadine's voice was steady as stone, unbreakable. "You can sit down, too." Gwendolyn sat, slowly, like a woman whose legs had suddenly forgotten how to hold her. Her pearls, the ones that had caught the candlelight earlier like badges of honor, suddenly looked heavy, like chains. Broderick was frozen. His hands were flat on the table. His jaw was locked so tight the tendons in his neck were visible. He looked around the room for someone, anyone, who might meet his eyes and offer something. A nod, a word, a lifeline. But no one did. 200 people in that room, and not one of them looked at him. Not one. Pastor Achebe removed his glasses slowly. He looked at Broderick for a long, measured moment, the way a man looks at something he no longer recognizes. Then he shook his head. Once. Slowly. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. That headshake carried more weight than any sermon he'd ever delivered. The silence in that room was so complete that the hum of the air conditioning became the loudest sound anyone could hear. 200 people sat in it, breathed in it, felt the shape of it pressing against their chests. Broderick opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He looked at Nadine, but she was already done. She placed the USB drive on the podium, gently, the way you set something down when you no longer need to carry it. She picked up her clutch. She turned toward the side door, and she walked out of that room the same way she'd walked in, without looking back, without raising her voice, without breaking. The door closed softly behind her, and 200 people sat in the wreckage of a man who had confused silence with weakness and calm with surrender. By Monday morning, the banquet was the only thing anyone in the community was talking about. Guests had recorded it, not the whole speech, but the parts that mattered. The clips circulated through group chats, church threads, and community social media pages like a fire nobody wanted to put out. Broderick's name became a sentence nobody wanted to finish. People who had shaken his hand the week before crossed the street when they saw him coming. The barber who'd cut his hair for 3 years suddenly couldn't fit him into the schedule. His employer initiated an internal review within days. The financial manipulation Nadine had described at the banquet raised questions about Broderick's integrity in other areas: expense reports, client contracts, the kind of numbers a man who commits fraud at home might also bend at work. The company couldn't afford the association. He was placed on administrative leave by Wednesday. His office was cleared out by Friday, his nameplate removed from the door. His parking space was reassigned by the following Monday to a junior associate who had never lied about a single receipt. Gwendolyn's phone stopped ringing. The women she'd sat beside in church for 20 years, the ones she'd shared prayer circles with, organized food drives with, exchanged recipes and Christmas cards with, quietly removed her from their group chats and contacts. She was uninvited from the Women's Ministry Leadership Committee. No one called to explain. They didn't need to. She knew why. She had sat at a table every Sunday and smiled at the woman her son was destroying, and now every woman in that church was wondering what Gwendolyn had smiled at them about. Broderick blamed his mother. He showed up at her house 3 days after the banquet and stood in her kitchen and said, "This is your fault. If you hadn't sent those emails, none of this would have happened." Gwendolyn looked at her son, the man she'd spent years protecting and positioning and coaching toward what she believed was his best life, and for the first time, she saw him clearly. He didn't blame himself. He blamed the woman who helped him. That's who he was. That's who he'd always been. And she had made him that way. Shayla was gone before the weekend was over. She packed her things from the house in a single afternoon while Broderick was out trying to find an attorney who would take his case. She didn't leave a note, didn't text goodbye. He called her that night, and the next morning, and the morning after that. She never answered, not once. Shayla wanted the lifestyle, not the wreckage. She wanted the house with the curtains and the lemonade and the throw pillows. She didn't want the man who came with the rubble. The court blocked Broderick's title transfer within 10 days of Nadine's filing. Her counterpetition, supported by every document on the USB drive, established her legal ownership of the property and secured financial protections for her unborn child. The judge reviewed Gwendolyn's emails, the fraudulent insurance modification, and the timeline of the attempted transfer. The ruling was swift. The ruling was decisive. The house, the one Broderick had thrown Nadine out of, was hers, legally, permanently, completely. Broderick tried to call Nadine. She didn't answer. He drove by Imani's apartment and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at the building like it might open a door for him. It didn't. He drove away, slowly, the way a man drives when he has nowhere left to go. He went back to the house, his house, he still called it, though the paperwork said otherwise, and stood in the living room. It was quiet, cold, the kind of cold that doesn't come from the temperature. Shayla's curtains never went up. Gwendolyn wouldn't visit. The throw pillows were still rearranged from the day Shayla had sat on that couch, scrolling her phone like she owned the place. The lemonade pitcher was still in the fridge, sour now, forgotten. The coaster from Nadine's mother sat on the coffee table with a ring stain from a glass that would never be refilled. The bags he'd thrown on the driveway were gone, and so was everything they represented. 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, Nadine sat in a rocking chair by the nursery window of a small two-bedroom apartment she'd signed the lease on herself. Her newborn son, Elijah, was asleep against her chest. His tiny fingers curled around the collar of her shirt like he was holding on to the safest place he'd ever known. The room was quiet, except for the birds outside and the soft creak of the chair against the hardwood floor. The apartment was modest but warm. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with titles she'd been meaning to read for years and was finally reading. Framed photographs of Nadine and Imani, of her mother, of a few close friends who had shown up when it mattered, filled the spaces between the shelves. A small desk sat in the corner with a stack of study guides and a laptop. Nadine had enrolled in a CPA certification program and was 3 modules in, studying at night after Elijah fell asleep. The USB drive sat in a drawer beneath a manila folder. It had served its purpose. It had done what it was meant to do. Now it rested, quiet and unremarkable, like a soldier after the war. Imani came by that morning with flowers, sunflowers, because she knew Nadine loved them, and a bag of groceries. She held Elijah while Nadine ate breakfast at a kitchen table she'd picked out herself. Round, small, just big enough for 2. They didn't talk about Broderick. They didn't need to. There was nothing left to say about a man who had been given everything and burned it to the ground with his own hands, then blamed the fire on the people standing closest to it. Later that afternoon, Nadine stood at the window with a cup of coffee in her hand. The sun came through the curtains she'd chosen in a color she liked, in a home that carried no one's name but hers. She looked out at the quiet street below, a woman walking a dog, a child riding a bicycle in slow circles, the ordinary beauty of a life that belonged entirely to her. No one was watching. No one was performing. No one was lying in the next room with their phone face down. She wasn't looking back. She wasn't waiting for anyone. She was simply standing in her own life, on her own terms, with her son asleep in the next room and the whole morning ahead of her like a blank page she could fill however she wanted. Broderick's name appeared on her phone one last time, a text message that said simply, "Can we talk?" Nadine read it. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she set the phone face down on the counter and walked to the nursery. She picked up Elijah and held him close. His heartbeat was small and fast against hers. She closed her eyes. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Some conversations are over before they begin. Some doors close so quietly that the person on the other side doesn't hear it until they try the handle and find it locked. There is a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shout. It doesn't perform. It doesn't post on social media or call a press conference. It sits quietly inside a woman who was thrown away and refused to stay broken. It waits. It watches. It takes notes. And when the time comes, it speaks the truth in a voice so steady it makes an entire room of 200 people fall completely silent. Nadine didn't win because she fought. She won because she knew. She knew her worth. She knew the documents. She knew the difference between a house and a home. And she knew that the man who told her to follow her bags would one day stand in an empty room wishing she'd come back to fill it. Some people throw you away because they think you're worth nothing. But the ones who survive being thrown away, they're the ones who learn exactly what they're worth. If this story reminded you of that truth, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, stories about strength, dignity, and the quiet power of knowing your own value, stay close. We're just getting started.